Ready to go. All right. We are connected. Wow. Good stuff. Okay, we're ready to go. Weird. Good stuff. Boom, boom. All right. We're ready to go. 3 different avenues. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back. If you're new here, this is All Her Work. I teach the biology of women's lives, and not like the watered down version, the real thing. Today, I want to talk about something I've been sitting with personally for a long time. I want to talk about what your body already knows. Um, you know, before language, before therapy, before framework at all. And this has kind of been the theme at All Her Work live streams for the last little bit, because I think a lot of us are walking around with a knowledge base in our nervous systems that we were never given the vocabulary for. And what happens when you don't have vocabulary for something very real, we tend to pathologize it, medicate it, call it anxiety or codependency or being too much, being broken in some particular way. And today, we're just going to call it something different. Today, we're going to call it what it actually is. And we're going to cover 3 things in this teaching in particular. And the first is the biology, as always, what stress actually does to a nervous system across generations, like the actual mechanism itself. The second is the history. So because you can't understand the biology without understanding the specific institutional forces that produced it, for a lot of us, that means colonialism. That means what was done to maternal lineages, specifically over centuries. Um, and the third is a framework, a name for a particular kind of nervous system that emerges from this intersection, one that I think a lot of you already do recognize. We've discussed a little bit already, so let's get into it. I want to start with a system that I think most of you have heard, but maybe haven't had explained in a way that connects to your actual life. And it's called the HPA axis. And HPA stands for the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal. And here's the short version of what it does. So it's your body's central stress response system. And when your brain detects a threat, any threat, physical danger, relational danger, social danger, a signal fires from the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland to the adrenal glands, and cortisol gets released. Cortisol is the primary stress hormone. So it sharpens your attention, it mobilizes your energy, it tells your body, this is not a moment to rest. This is a moment to survive. And this is where I want you to understand, what I want you to understand about this system that doesn't get taught enough is that the HPA axis is calibrated. Okay. It's not fixed, it learns. And what it learns is how much threat is normal in this environment. So it calibrates itself based on very early experience most of the time, based on what the environment you grew up in taught your nervous system to expect. So if you grew up in an environment where the threat was chronic, where there was ongoing violence or instability or a caregiver who was themselves dysregulated, Your HPA axis did not malfunction, it actually adapted, right? It said, okay, this is the kind of world I'm in. I will calibrate my baseline toward higher vigilance because that is what survival in this environment requires. So here's where it gets important for today's teaching in particular. This calibration begins before birth. So I'm drawing here from McEwen's allostatic load framework, from Yehuda's and colleagues' work on epigenetics and trauma, from Gunnar and Quevedo on HPA axis development, showing that the gestational environment shapes fetal stress responsivity. Okay. So what that means in plain language is if a mother is carrying pregnancy under conditions of chronic stress, the fetus is being bathed in stress hormones. And those hormones are not, incidental, they're informational. They're telling the developing nervous system the world you're coming into is a high threat environment. So prepare accordingly. And this is actually preparation. It appears to be damaged and can be damaging, yes, but it's also preparation. Both things can be true. The tragedy is that, the preparation is accurate and then the world changes or the specific threat changes form and the nervous system is still running the old calibration. Allostatic load is the term for the cumulative cost of this kind of chronic recalibration. So your body can sustain high vigilance. It's built to, but sustained chronic multi-generational high vigilance has costs to the immune system, to the cardiovascular system, to the endocrine system, and obviously to the capacity for rest. So we're going to come back to that cost a little bit later. Hold that for now. I need to spend a few minutes on epigenetics because this is where the conversation about generational trauma moves from metaphor to mechanism. Okay. So epigenetics literally means above the genome. It refers to changes in how genes are expressed, which genes get switched on, which get switched off without changing the underlying DNA sequence itself. Okay. So your genes, are not your destiny in the way we used to think. Your genes are more like a library. Okay. So epigenetic mechanisms are the librarians. They decide which books get taken off the shelf and which ones stay shelved. Okay. Here is what the research shows. Experience changes the librarians. So specifically, chronic stress produces methylation changes, chemical tags on DNA that affect gene expression. So researchers, including Rachel Yehuda and her colleagues, have actually documented this in survivors of trauma and critically in their children. Okay. So one of the most studied genes in this context is called the FKBP5. It regulates cortisol sensitivity and it shows differential methylation patterns in people with trauma histories and their offspring. I really want to be precise here because the science absolutely matters and I don't want to overstate it. Multi-generational epigenetic transmission, the idea that these marks travel beyond the first generation is established in animal research and suggestive in human research, but not yet conclusively proven across more than one or two generations of humans. What is strongly supported is developmental programming. So the mechanism I just described, where the gestational environment, shapes fetal neurodevelopment. And that means even if we can't yet prove that your great-grandmother's cortisol tags are literally on your DNA, we can trace a chain. Each generation of mothers under stress produces gestational environments that recalibrate the next generation's nervous system. So the mechanism really doesn't require germline transmission. It requires only that stress conditions persist, which, as we're about to see, they do. The other mechanism worth naming is the oxytocin system. So oxytocin is sometimes called the bonding hormone. which is a little reductive in my opinion, but it captures something real. It's released during attachment. Okay. So during nursing, during physical contact, during moments of emotional intimacy, it regulates your social behavior, your trust, importantly, stress response modulation, right? So a well-functioning oxytocin system helps regulate cortisol, right? So disruptions in early maternal attachment, when the caregiver should be activating the system, is absent, or herself is dysregulated, or is taken away, affect the development of this system in ways that have downstream effects on relational capacity, right? So when I talk about attachment rupture in one moment, this is part of what I mean mechanically. Mechanically. Oh my God. Sometimes some words just don't want to come out. So one more biological framework before we get into the history, because it literally connects everything. Life history theory, okay, comes from evolutionary biology. It describes the trade-offs organisms make between survival, growth, and reproduction-based environmental conditions. So the core principle is unpredictable high mortality environments, organisms that tend to accelerate, they reproduce earlier, they invest less in any single offspring and more in quantity. Um, they prioritize short-term survival over long-term growth. And in stable, low mortality environments, organisms slow down, right? Later reproduction, more investment per offspring, more emphasis on growth and longevity. And humans show this pattern as well. So research shows that early life stress correlates with earlier menarche, accelerated reproductive timing, and a heightened orientation toward immediate survival over long-term investment. So this is like we've gone beyond pathology now, right? This is an organism correctly reading its environment and adjusting its life history accordingly, right? So this matters for today's teaching because the lineage that we're going to trace in the next section shows this acceleration pattern precisely. So a young girl loses her mother. She marries at 12. She's widowed at 16. She carries 20 pregnancies throughout her life. Her body is doing what bodies under conditions of chronic stress and threat and unpredictable mortality have always done, right? And those of us descended from lineages like that, those of us whose great great grandmothers were doing the biological math of survival in real time, we carry the echoes of that calibration forward. That's our starting point. So now we're going to talk about the history. And I want to be precise about what I mean when I say settler colonialism, because I'm not using it as a political signifier. I'm using it as a structural descriptor. Okay. Big difference. So settler colonialism is a specific form of colonial organization in which the goal is not just extraction, not just taking resources, but replacement, right? The settler colony requires the elimination of existing social structures and their replacement with settler structures, land, governance, kinship, language, religion. And for maternal lineages specifically, settler colonialism operates through what I'll call 3 intersecting vectors. Okay, so the first is what the research literature calls a male trauma vector. So war, paternal abandonment, addiction, untreated psychological dysregulation, domestic violence. When we look at the research on combat trauma, and there is a lot of it, we know that untreated exposure to war, that untreated exposure produces specific disruptions, right? So emotional numbing, hyperarousal, irritability, attachment withdrawal. A man that returned from war who has no support for that trauma brings it home. And when it arrives in a household, it doesn't stay contained. it moves through the relational systems, right? It destabilizes the mother. It destabilizes us, and like this destabilized mother cannot fully regulate the infant. The infant's HPA axis calibrates to that destabilization, right? The cycle continues. There's a lot more biology to this than meets the eye. And I'm not blaming individual men here. I'm naming a structural fact. When institutions send men to war and return them without care, the cost of that abandonment is paid by the families, by the mothers, by the children, specifically the daughters. The second vector is maternal attachment rupture. So here we have maternal death, child death, institutional removal of children from mothers, daughter estrangement enforced across racial lines, legal custody transfer. And these are not the same event, but they have convergent physiological effects. So the research is clear that the nervous system does not clearly distinguish between a mother lost to illness and a mother lost to a court order. The attachment system responds to separation, period. So the stress hormones will then rise. The developmental programming is then affected. The cycle continues. This is important to say out loud, because modern institutional rupture, family court, child protective services, psychiatric intervention in custody disputes often presents itself as benevolent, as child protection. And I'm not here to make a blanket argument about those institutions. What I am saying is that their effects on attachment systems are very real and are not neutral. So a child removed from a mother, regardless of the stated reason, experiences that removal in the physiology. Okay? So the third vector is the institutional reinforcement factor. So this is essentially colonial displacement, racial enforcement, the legal apparatus that in 19th century Ireland taught daughters that their autonomy was very conditional, that their bodies were managed first by fathers, then by husbands, then by churches, and then by the state. So the workhouse system that moralized poverty and taught girls that destitution was a character failure. The family court system that in modern iterations continues to enforce particular assumptions about which parent is more credible, which family structure is more legible, which woman's account of events is worth believing. And we can see a lot of examples of this right now happening all over. So these three vectors, when they intersect, male trauma destabilizes the maternal environment, maternal attachment ruptures, institutions reinforce the rupture rather than repair it, and across generations, this produces what the research framework calls a lineage level attachment destabilization architecture. And that's a phrase worth sitting with, I think. That is a massive term. That's a massive phrase, lineage level attachment destabilization architecture. That's not one bad generation, right? That's not one difficult relationship. That's a structure built across time, reproduced by intersecting forces that don't require individual malice to function. Okay, so let's make this concrete. I want to trace a lineage that spans my lineage, roughly 185 years, from a Métis woman on the frontier of what is now Manitoba to a woman in the present day. So I'm using documented case research here. So this is my fourth great grandmother, Catherine Thoreau Lafair. So she was born in St. Boniface in 1839 with a Métis kinship context. She died at 35, and her daughter died the same day. You might have heard me talk about this. It's profound. That's the founding event of this lineage, simultaneous maternal child mortality during the colonial frontier period. So very high reproductive load, and no infrastructure for care. So generation two, we have Marie Gendron, and that's Catherine's daughter. So Marie was 12 when her mom died. Her sister died the same day. She married between 12 and 13, and she was widowed by 16. She carried more than 20 pregnancies, multiple infant and child deaths across her life. Marie's life is a clinical illustration of life history acceleration under conditions of maximum instability. So her nervous system, calibrated in the gestational environment of a grieving, stressed mother developing in a world where death was structurally predictable, organized itself around survival, biological endurance, high reproductive output, and the body doing what bodies in those conditions have always done. So then we're going to move to generation three, Eva Victoria Collins. This is my great grandmother, born a twin, multiple sibling deaths, lost a son at 14, and she was married to a Irish settler. So is this her life seemed very calm. She was born later in the script system. She was not told of her heritage, ever, it appears, and that's intense. So we're going to move to generation four. So this is my grandmother. Her first daughter was had at 16. And her first husband and her did not stay together. And then she met my grandfather. And he had just returned from war, the Korean War, quite emotionally detached. So enforced estrangement from her eldest daughter across racial lines. So the institutional reinforcement factor arriving in the specific form of racialized family surveillance here. Okay, so generation five, my mother at 36, my mom's husband attempted lethal violence, ex-husband. My sibling was the one who was put in the position of having to save her, call police. Child Protective Services then removes the younger children. So now we're going to notice here what has happened. The rupture mechanism has modernized, right? We're no longer talking about maternal death on the frontier. But we are talking about Child Protective Services, family court, psychiatric labeling, deployed within custodial disputes. The institutional form has changed, but the attachment destabilization is structurally identical. And that really matters. So generation six, present, 4 long-term relationships characterized by attachment instability. 4 children, each daughter primarily residing with the father over time, family court reinforcement of paternal custody. So 6 generations. We see the rupture mechanism changes in form in every generation, but the attachment destabilization architecture that recurs in every generation. And that's just not a coincidence. That is, in fact, architecture. So I want to pause just for a moment on the Irish piece of this lineage because it really adds something specific. The research on 19th century Ireland, documents how daughters were formed through an overlapping set of institutions, and we've gone through this in our other lives on all her work. Household economy, church, schooling, community surveillance, state law. Those are our mains. Yikes. Useful, respectable, poise, socially accountable. A woman who understood her value in terms of her usefulness to others. So a woman whose sexuality and reproduction were managed by external authorities, a woman whose capacity for connection through the keening traditions, through kinship networks, through the household religious role, that was the one domain of the real institutional power available to her. and was simultaneous greatest strength and, the most regulated act of her existence, most likely. So the post-Roman Catholic formation is particularly significant here because after the famine, after a catastrophic loss of life that the British state prevented, arguably facilitated, the Catholic Church became the primary institutional structure through which identity was organized. And like that role assignment to women within that structure was keeper of the moral household, transmitter of religious discipline, guardian of respectability, right? Which, like, what does that do to a nervous system across generations is the question I think we asked. Because to be the person responsible for the moral and relational stability of everyone around you, while your own autonomy is structurally constrained, while your own losses are not publicly acknowledged, while the institutions that surround you enforce your secondary status, and then ask you to transfer values of those same institutions to your daughters. What kind of nervous system do you build when that is the curriculum? You build a regulator. And we've discussed this one for a bit as well. So we're going to touch on the regulator framework again because it names something that has been real for a long time, but has mostly been described in pathological terms. So the regulator phenotype describes a particular configuration of nervous system characteristics that emerge from the intersection of multi-generational stress calibration, heightened perceptual sensitivity, and relational environments that require early development of emotional regulation and pattern recognition. So what this nervous system looks like in particular. So advanced environmental pattern recognition. Regulators read rooms the way other people. They detect interpersonal tension way before it's named out loud. They map relational dynamics across time and context. This is not, personality trait, which I feel like most of us think it is. This is much more than that. This is a sensory and cognitive capability that was built over years of necessity, because it was survival relevant, and a stabilization reflex. So when relational systems destabilize, when conflict rises, when someone in the room is escalating, when the emotional weather shifts, the regulator will move toward it, and not always consciously. And this is why it's so important to understand this. That this reflex is often automatic. They mediate, they translate, they absorb, and this becomes problematic. This reflex is not chosen, but it comes at a cost. It fires before the conscious mind has got up to it. So complexity tolerance, regulators can hold contradictory emotional realities simultaneously without collapsing them. Skills. They can recognize abusive behavior and still hold empathy for the person. They can track a relational system without reducing it to good and bad. And many people call this trauma bonding. This capacity looks from the outside sometimes like wisdom. From the outside, it often feels like the inability to simply be outraged or be done, the way other people seem to be able to. And this one is probably the most fascinating: burnout elasticity. So regulators can sustain high output functioning under conditions that would incapacitate other nervous systems. And then they crash, and then they recover, and then they sustain again. And the oscillation between extreme endurance and collapse is wild, and not weakness. It's actually the autonomic pattern of a system that was calibrated for high chronic demand. So again, the body doing exactly what it was designed for. And here's the real critical piece, okay? The regulator's capabilities are real. Like, they're not performed, they are not the result of trying harder than other people. They are a genuine perceptual and relational intelligence that was built at a significant cost under conditions of chronic instability. So the problem is not actually the individual's capability. The problem is the context in which it keeps being deployed. So here's what tends to happen. Regulators and destabilizing partners find each other. And that's, not a reflection of personal failure. It's not that they lack self-worth in any simple sense, because their nervous systems are calibrated to interpret need as invitation, because the destabilizing partner offers exactly the relational environment that their capabilities were built for. Intermittent vulnerability, emotional unpredictability, a system that rewards vigilance and pattern recognition and stabilization, right? The cycle can look like this. The partner destabilizes, the regulator stabilizes. The partner receives regulation, the bond deepens. The partner's intermittent moments of vulnerability, brief openings, apology cycles, moments of genuine connection function is what researchers call intermittent reinforcement. So the unpredictable reward, the thing that neurochemically is more powerful than a consistent reward, because the nervous system never fully stops anticipating it. I happened once, it could happen again, right? The regulator is not in this relationship because they are weak. They are in it because it is neurofamiliar. Because it activates the same regulatory loops that were activated in childhood between a hypervigilant nervous system and a stable environment. You see, it removes the personal failure, and that's the deepest part of it. A regulator regulating the relational system itself is regulatory. The act of stabilizing someone else, of bringing coherence to a chaotic emotional environment, activates the regulator's nervous system in a way that feels like calm. It's a version of co-regulation in which the regulator regulates through regulating, which means that the partner is not giving the regulator calm at all, right? The regulator is generating their own calm by performing their function. And this is a profound reframe of what looks like dependence, right? What it explains is, why simply deciding not to do it anymore is not as straightforward as it sounds from the outside. How do regulators exit these systems? Not typically through a single moment of clarity or a clean break or reaching a limit of pain. The research suggests that regulators exit through what I'm calling pattern saturation. So there are 5 stages. The unconscious stabilizer. So the regulator is doing what they have always done automatically without a framework for it. Stage 2, exhausted regulator. The chronic overfunctioning produces burnout, right? Emotional exhaustion, withdrawal, a beginning question of relational dynamics, but without yet being able to name a structure. And then we get to stage 3, pattern saturation. Okay, so the regulator can now see the entire cycle, not just the current relationship, but the architecture of all relationships. They recognize the pattern as a pattern. Curiosity decreases, the intermittent reinforcement loses its grip because the mechanism is now visible. Or boundary emergence, the regulator begins interpreting stabilization reflex, right? This is enormously uncomfortable. It produces guilt because the reflex says someone needs you. It produces fear of abandonment because the path has stopped regulating. You will lose the connection. It produces a specific kind of grief that is not about the particular relationship, but about the whole architecture. Stage 5, the conscious regulator. Beautiful. The regulator retains the capacity, the pattern recognition, the attunement, the complexity tolerance. These don't go away, but they're now selectively deployed, right? Chosen rather than automatic. This is, this is maturation of the regulator. And I want to say something about the grief in stage 4 because this was very heavy for myself. It didn't get attention. When a regulating nervous system reaches pattern saturation and begins to interrupt the stabilization reflex, the grief is not primarily about the particular partner or the particular relationship. It's actually about like what Marie's body carried through 20 pregnancies, right? It's about every generation of women who had their stabilization reflex demanded of them by institutions, unstable men, by children they couldn't always protect, without ever having their own capacity for rest and, receipt recognized as real, and like that grief is very legitimate. It's actually enormous. And it is, I think, a massive part of the work. Um, I bring this back to where we started. Your body knows things. Your nervous system was calibrated not arbitrarily, not pathologically, but by real conditions, across real generations. The hypervigilance is information. The relational intelligence is real. The burnout pattern is the positive capability that was built for a world that kept demanding it, right? And naming it, naming this phenotype, the regulator phenotype, this is part of my dissertation and my master's degree, is not about creating, a new diagnosis by any stretch of the imagination. It's about refusing the diagnoses that were there before. Codependent, anxious, attachment, too sensitive, too much. These names locate the problem in the individual, and they suggest that something went wrong in her specifically. And what this framework says instead is something is demanded of her specifically across generations with precision. And her nervous system did exactly what nervous systems do. It adapted. So, the work is not to fix what is then broken. The work is to bring into conscious relationships, what has been operating automatically. To recognize the station reflex when it fires, not to eliminate it, but to choose, to build for the first time in perhaps 6 generations, a relational environment in which your capacity for regulation is matched by a capacity for a receipt. And that is the work. So here's what I want you to take with you. You're not too much. You're literally precisely calibrated. So the next time you hear that you're doing whatever, the question is not whether the calibration is appropriate. It was for the environment that produced it. It was, the question is whether you want to keep running that calibration in this environment right now for this life and for the generations that come after you. And you actually get to answer that question. And your great grandmother. Powerful. I really want to thank you all for joining me. That is the gift and the weight of being the first generation with the tools, right? So thank you for being here. Thank you for showing up. I love doing these. As always, if this resonated, share it with someone who could use the language. And if your thing was something that this opened up, girl, that's what the comments in the community are for. I will see you next week. Thank you so much for joining me. Oh, where's my